What it is you think that most breathwork instructors are probably missing when it comes to good breathwork?
An understanding of respiratory physiology and breath mechanics, understanding how we actually breathe, why we breathe like we do, and what's going on.
Mm.
So I think and also understanding trauma and stress management as a biped.
Hmm.
You know, we breathe in a very unique and particular way amongst other mammals. So there's aspects of breathing which are interesting for us and very different to other mammals. And if you don't understand those pieces around why we breathe like we breathe, what the impacts of any breathwork technique are on respiratory physiology, if you don't understand myofascial connections through the web of fascia and the muscles of breathing, you're going to be doing stuff that may be briefly helpful for somebody, or may not be. It maybe just make what they're doing worse, because there are about 13 or so breathing pattern disorders. And if somebody's running with a breathing pattern disorder from their personal history and how they've managed breath and emotion and stress, then they're going to, and you do something that can just make it worse. And that's
Mm.
not helpful. So it's understanding those kind of things. And I think I think breath work in the West is in its immaturity. It's not mature yet. And I think it's beginning to be. And I see more and more stuff online, which is good, which is around, breath physiology, breath mechanics, all these kind of, functional breathing, this kind of thing. So I think a lot of stuff that's going on is still in development, as it were, as a a way of being, an ology, breathology, as it were. It's not really, to coin a term. Of course, that's Stig Severinsen's term, but that aside, yeah, it's a whole lot of work to do to develop it yet.
Yeah. Ironically, I was with Stig yesterday. He was just in my community doing the presentation, so
Yeah,
I just spent some time with him. I didn't realise you guys had done work together till I was doing some
yeah, yeah.
research for this, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, I like
So
Stig. He's a good lad.
he's a tour de force, I would say. He's got a lot of energy, that guy.
Yeah.
Yeah. So can we break that down a little bit then? So, what do you mean by breath mechanics, and what are some of these things? What are these breathing patterns? Don't expect you to list all 13, but give me an example of what you mean by different breathing patterns.
Sure. Um, the first, I think, the place to begin with it to make sense of it, is actually understanding why humans breathe like we do. All right, and it's simply because we've come up on 2 feet. That's the main reason. And there's a whole kind of suite of changes that happens to enable that, which is Achilles tendons, nuchal ligaments on the back of the throat. If you think about a cat or a dog, it's kind of horizontal, the spine's horizontal, its diaphragm's vertical like that. So you shift that all the other way up, and there's a whole lot of things that have to change, including the relationship of the the respiratory diaphragm, and the pelvic diaphragm, which work in harmony. So all of that has shifted and changed, and that puts the belly facing forwards. And as I say, any sensible mammal would have its belly down to the floor because it's extremely vulnerable. And what's happened to us in terms of our evolution is we've lost claws. We don't have big claws. We don't have big teeth. The face has shrunk because this bit, the head and shoulders, have to come through a birth canal. There's only so much real estate you can have to be born as a mammal, and that has to be used up for something. And if you're using it for big teeth and big jaw and scary teeth and bite muscles, then you can't have a big brain. So given we're vulnerable and we have to manage social situations because we're a social mammal, then what evolution or nature has done for us is give us communication. What I'm doing right now is extending a cute long exhale, squeezing it into little bits with respiratory muscles, and hopefully making some kind of stuff happening with my tongue and my jaw and anything else to make some kind of sense that you're translating. Inhale through the nose, hopefully, in between. Yeah. So there's that it instantly uncouples breath from metabolism and links breath to communication, and that's powerful. But the complexity comes because then we know from electromyographs and that when somebody thinks something, that the muscles in the face and the jaw are active, just with thinking. They're microactive, but they're active. Right? So if when we think something, it impacts the muscles in the face and the jaw, cranial nerves. It impacts the upper trapezius muscle, which is connected to that. It impacts the vagus nerve. It impacts respiratory structures. So instantly, when we think something, and especially if it's complicated, then we start impacting our breathing, which then changes our breathing physiology. It changes the way the blood gases move in the body, and it changes oxygenation of the brain, amongst other things. So it's a whole suite of changes that happen simply from thinking really difficult things. Yeah?
Yeah.
Because of that uncoupling. So that creates massive problems, and that's basically why humans breathe badly, is because we've lost, we're out of our evolutionary context as I'd say hunter-gatherers, but actually it's gatherer-hunters. We got it the wrong way around because it's mostly gathering, a little bit of hunting, not a lot. But anyway, that aside. One of my backgrounds is evolutionary biology. I'm a biologist. So that kind of suite of changes is impactful on breath and breath work. We have to understand some of that stuff to understand then what's happening with any breathing pattern disorder, because the breathing pattern disorder is a way we can cover that terrain in a minute if you want to, but it is then a way we then use breathing to manage state. And usually it's complex because of it happens when we're young.
Hey, just pausing the podcast for 2 seconds. Do us a quick favour. Leave us a comment down below. Let us know something that you've learned or enjoyed from this show so far. In doing so, it appeals to the YouTube gods, and it means more people are likely to find this podcast. Also, it's going to help you remember whatever it is that you've enjoyed so far. And anybody scrolling the comments are also going to get some benefits as well. So help us out, and let's get back on with the show. Cheers.
So there's so many ways I could go with this now, because I'm obsessed with gatherer hunters. I've not heard it that way around. That's really interesting.
On that one for me, it's just because the people who did the research were blokes, basically.
Right.
And
Yeah,
the whole this is aside maybe, but the whole kind of paleo movement was based on a false premise, because the people that looked at it weren't anthropologists, and they looked at the research that had been done on men who were hunting and ignored all the work the women did, which was gathering roots, tubers, berries, and everything else. So it's all based on the hunter-gatherers ate lots of meat. Well, lots of honey actually, but anyway, it's complicated. Yeah,
no, really. I often think like we've moved so far away. I sit all day. I'm in artificial light. I'm chewing soft foods. How much damage do you think modernity's done to us in terms of our breathing, our mental health? All these creature comforts we've got, or what Doran O'Lean calls fatal conveniences. How much damage has that done, and how much of it can be reversed through the kind of work that you do?
This is exactly the topic of the book that I'm writing. All right, so to look at there's a principle called the mismatch. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's the work of people like Professor Viber, Craig and Reed, Dan Lieberman as well is big on this. From Exercise, Born to Run, he's wrote lots of stuff. Evolution of the Human Head, he's written a lot of really good books. So it's Professor Dan Lieberman, Professor Viber, Craig and Reed. There's a whole lot of people involved in this kind of mismatch thing, and it's basically looking at what our evolutionary biology is, and then understanding the impact of that because of modern culture. And like you said, it's to do with movement, it's to do with the way we think, it's to do with business, it's to do with everything we do. Soft foods, so many different variables that come into play in terms of that. And breath is definitely one of them. And we can, in my view, we can use breath work as a key tool to start to understand and regulate that if we link it with other things. I mean, in my view, it's an extremely useful tool. But if you don't use it with understanding how your brain works and what you're doing up here in terms of thinking, it's only got a limited value. So I link it with what I call three meta disciplines. And meta simply means useful. And one is mind training. You have to understand this thing, how it works, and be able to optimize this function. Otherwise, you're going to keep repeating the patterns, which isn't going to get you very far. So you can do a bit of breath work as a band-aid, but if you're not working with the brain effectively in mind training, then it's not going to go very far. And the other thing I think is really important is what I call embodied awareness, which is actually function, because intelligence in the body, and again, there's some great stuff out there. Who's the guy who's written the book, Intelligence in the Flesh? That's by Guy Claxton. Really, really good book. But we're now in a place where we understand that this isn't a brain taxi to get the brain to the office. The mind as the field of sentience includes all the information coming up from the body to the brain as well, and that's a lot. Most of it's from that. So this, intelligence in the flesh is in feeling, not in thinking. And you can't think your way into the body; it's impossible. You've got to feel your way in. So embodied awareness is about increasing capacity for interoception in the tissues, in the flesh, in the organs, and what that gives you is a key tool for catching patterns, stress-based patterns, for example, as they're arising in the glands, in the muscles, in tensioning of muscles, in patterning of the body. And emotions arise out of sensations. Again, if we look at something like, I don't know if you know, what's her name again? How Emotions Are Made, Lisa Feldman Barrett, the constructionist theory of emotions, which is a recent evolutionary look at what emotions are, because reptiles don't do them. They don't have an emotional brain, but we do. So what are they? And they're ways our brain translates resource levels and sensations in the body to translate it into how to relate in this particular social. What do I do in this social interaction? And it's like, shorthand systems to be able to automatically do something, which in an evolutionary sense makes lots of sense. But in terms of modern culture, it's a bit like we need to really understand this stuff, otherwise we're just being pushed and pulled around by biological algorithms. But that awareness in the body begins to give us an angle in. If you could link it with the mind training and link it with the conscious breath work and bring the three together, what we get is this kind of unified approach to approach this human livingness and really help to optimize it. And I think breath work is one of the, when we understand it well, is one of the key tools to do that really, really well.
And those three metas, are they of equal importance, or do they have a ranking priority?
I would say they're pretty much of equal importance. I think if there is a ranking, then it's contextual, and it depends on the immediacy of the situation that somebody's in, because you can, it may be that somebody needs an emergency tool or a tool to deal with a particular context, in which case then, your conscious breath work might be the one to call on in that moment. And another time, so I think it varies. I think it's contextual.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And talk to us a little bit more then, if you can, about the breathing patterns, because this is quite fascinating. So, do they have names? How are you assessing somebody? So if I come into you today, what sort of things are you doing? What sort of things are you asking? Sort of things are you looking for? Are you measuring breath holds? Just give us a little flavour of like what those assessments might look like.
I mean, there are several different ways of measuring. First of all, how somebody's actually breathing, what muscles they're using, and how those muscles work together. So, for example, if we look at there's a couple of styles of breathing, one called reverse breathing, one called paradoxical breathing. They're both very related, very similar. And they are using accessory muscles of breathing. So the main muscle of breathing is the diaphragm, which is uniquely mammalian, by the way. There's no other creature has it. And what that does is it pressurizes the abdomen on an inhalation, and reduces the pressure in the chest, in the thoracic cavity, which sucks air in. That's what an inhale is for us. But those pressurized chambers have to work well. And if there's a whole range of reasons why they don't, again. But if somebody's learned, for example, let me ask you a question. Let's jump sideways and we'll come back in if that's all right, okay?
Sure.
How do you do stress? How do you, when you do really, really difficult, tough stress, you don't have to answer this, by the way, just feel it. When you do really difficult, tough, stressy things, all right, what do you do with your breath?
Ooh, I mean, for me, there's definitely some holds. There's some long exhales. There's a lot of sighs going on.
Yeah. And if there's a hold, what hold might it be?
Generally, for me, it's like a big old inhale hold.
Inhale, great. That's one really common pattern, all right? Mm-hmm. So the inhale hold, and some people do inhale hold and then build it up into something called hyperinflation, where they go, and it becomes an attitude in life. Walking on the front of the feet slightly, it's a hyperinflative position. Other people do it on the end of an exhale. So I've seen people, they flex the spine slightly, so you squeeze back a little bit, tip your pelvis back and squeeze slightly and squeeze out. And that's their stress management position, right? And just smile. It's all good. Yeah. Or you can do it with the freeze around the ribs, and you can do it left and right side. There's a lot of different variations we can do those management patterns, but we learn them in the first 8 to 10 years of life. Because at that time, a child is going through its emotional self-creation. It's exploring emotions, and it has emotional responses to bananas, or to the fact that banana isn't purple, or anything at all. And oftentimes when parents are busy or have a lot to do, they will tell the child, listen, you've got to stop being angry like that. Don't do that thing because it's really upsetting me, or whatever it is, or it's not contextually appropriate, or whatever. So the child has to learn to manage it. The prefrontal cortex, this bit that does executive control, doesn't come on to 27. So we really get neurologically adult when we're about 27, 24 to 27. Yeah. And that's interesting, because that means we just don't have the cortical capacity to understand, regulate, integrate those emotions in a meaningful way. So we have to learn to manage them. And because of the link I was talking about in us bipeds of breathing and communication, we do that with breathing muscles. We don't have a choice. So if you know, in any childhood adverse situation, it gets harder the more adverse the situation is. The patterns become more complicated, if you like, along with other patterns in the brain. But what happens then is there's a something that happens to manage that complexity, because that child, the scariest thing for any human being is being abandoned. We're social animals, we're social mammals, and being out of the pack is death. So when somebody threatens to abandon us or not love us by, maybe being abusive or ignoring us or whatever as little ones, what we have to do then is manage it in some way so we can carry on being lovable. So we internalize all that stuff, squeeze our breathing muscles and get on with life. And the patterns we do are various then, and we'll also copy our parents. So if one of our parents has a pattern of hyperinflation, say, then we're likely to copy that because we see that. Because children, when they grow in the first 8 years of life, are in what's called the theta state, which is basically the dream state. So it's an intense learning state where they are copying everything. And that's why it doesn't matter what you say to a child, it matters what you do. Children learn from example, right? So that's a critical time when all these patterns start to come into place. And of course, if you then zoom forward 20 years and somebody's in office trying to manage the boss, or whatever they're doing in the world, and trying to manage money and, 2 kids at home and all sorts of other things like that, those patterns then get exacerbated because of the complexity of the situation we're in. So people end up with these dysfunctional breathing patterns, and you add in COVID on top of that, where everybody had to wear a mask and nobody's been nasally trained, so everybody breathes through their mouth, and that then becomes a pattern. Because for us human beings, because breathing is linked to communication, breathing is a learned pattern. It's not just innate like it is for a dog. A dog or a cat, they run, they breathe faster. They stop running, the breathing slows down. End of story. Simple. With us, it's complicated. And of course, those learned patterns then, we then make meanings on top of what's happening. So it gets even more complicated, but there's layers of meaning then placed on top of what's happening about who we are and who we are in relationship with the world and what everything means. And that gets even more complicated, which is why those meta disciplines are needed to unpick all those patterns. It's not as simple as just having a little, let's breathe in for 4 and hold for 3 and breathe out for 8. That's not going to do the job. It might calm you down for a little while, it might, but it's not guaranteed. And say, for example, if you extend the exhale, but your trauma trigger or your stress trigger is at the end of the exhale, lengthening that exhale is going to take you into that place. So just because somebody else says lengthening the exhale is going to calm you down, well, it might not. Might just, trigger you. So there's this individual variation in everything. We then also have to pay attention. It gets more and more interesting and nuanced, right? So you asked the question of how would I check this? How would I do this? Well, what I do is I have client assessment protocols, which I work with. Now, there's great kits, the great stuff you can get out. There's great pieces of kit. There's Peter Litchfield, Better Physiology. He's produced a great piece of kit called the Capno Trainer. I haven't got one. I'd quite like one. If anybody wants to give me one, they're most welcome. Just saying. I could use it well. But that's a nice piece of kit because it measures real-time end PET CO2, which is end tidal CO2. So what you're measuring there is carbon dioxide in the blood, actually at the amount it is in the alveoli, or pretty darn close. So it's end of the exhalation. And that tells you the amount of carbon dioxide that's in the blood, in the lungs, in the arteries there. So that's really useful information because that measurement of carbon dioxide tells you, because, again, I don't know if any of your listeners have heard of the Bohr effect, but the Bohr effect is not boring at all. It's actually amazing because it talks about the way proteins fold and unfold. And the hemoglobin, which carries oxygen from the lungs through to the tissues, your brain, for example, which uses 20% of your oxygen, that is carried in the hemoglobin. But it's carried because the hemoglobin is a protein which can fold and unfold. Like a flower. It's incredible, all right? And what it does, it unfolds to release the oxygen if there's enough hydrogen ions there. But if there isn't enough hydrogen ions there, it can't let go of the oxygen. It just keeps going round with its oxygen held tight. And of course, the way we get hydrogen ions in the blood is because there's the right amount of carbon dioxide, which then splits into hydrogen ions and bicarbonates. So that's called the Bohr effect. The amount of carbon dioxide influences the amount of oxygen in the tissues. So if we're breathing badly, and we're breathing out and we haven't got enough carbon dioxide in the blood, and you can measure that with the end-tidal CO2, then that's a really good measure, because then you can see actually this isn't working very well. You've got really low carbon dioxide levels, and the first thing we need to do is work out exactly how to raise those carbon dioxide levels, because otherwise it's going to be difficult for you. So that's a really good measure. So Kaplan Trainer and stuff like that is really nice. There's one called the Caliber, which is just released in the States, which is much cheaper. Now, the Caliber is Sean Coakley's piece of kit. He's a fabulous guy. He used to work with Breathology. But his piece of kit it doesn't give you the same level of real-time measurement, but it gives you a percentage measurement. And, bang for buck, as it were, Caliber's pretty damn decent as well. So I'm advertising those two pieces because I think they're brilliant. To try and get kit that does that, otherwise you're talking tens of thousands of dollars. So that's the Kaplan Trainer. But if you haven't got that, then there's other things you can do. And there's things I know from Oxygen Vantage. There's the Bolt score and things like that, which gives you a rough and ready kind of measurement, as long as you haven't eaten recently. But it's very rough and ready. And it also depends on how much you can feel into your tissues, which is a measure of, so it's not accurate by any manner of means. But then there's the Stanford University test, which is how long you can exhale for, and you can join those together with something like an HRV measurement. And also another key piece is, how exactly is somebody breathing? When they breathe in, are they breathing through their nose? Are they breathing through their mouth? And if you just breathe in through your mouth now, you'll find it tends to take you into an upper chest breath. And of course, that means that you're breathing into the tubes and not down all the alveoli, which absorb oxygen, and oxygen gets diffused into the lungs from there. They're mostly down the bottom, again, because we're bipedal and gravity takes the blood down. So they're down here. So you want your breath to come down here into an abdominal breath, ideally, not up here. So if it's coming up here, you're not breathing very well. Yeah. So we can see where somebody's moving, and that breath, where the primary engine of the movement of the breath is up here, that's using accessory muscles of breathing. It's not mainly diaphragmatic. So it's not even energy efficient, because you're using muscles up here in the throat, scalenes and stuff. And so looking at how somebody's actually breathing is another measure. But then you can ask people questions as well, like, how stressed do you get when you get stressed? So on my client assessment protocol, I've got about 28 questions. I don't ask them all at once, but I've got them, and things like, how do you sleep? Do you wake up with a dry mouth? All sorts of things, because all those are indicators. If somebody's snoring at night time, they're going to have most likely less carbon dioxide in the blood. They're going to have some impact from that. So that's a lot of pieces you can use. And I think the more these become known publicly, the more people will demand it of their breath worker, which is because one of my keen interests is I want this world to be, top notch. I want excellence here. I want it to be really good, and that means all this stuff has to be shared and known.
Yeah, no, I definitely share that sentiment, and the whole reason I do this podcast is to get that information out there as much as we can, because I think from what I've seen, a lot of people get very focused on one or two particular modalities of breath, be it CO2 training or stretching or whatever it is, and I really am trying to get out there this helicopter approach to the breath, which is why I'm so excited to talk to you, because there's this all these gifts, all these different things, and the mind as well. And we've done some fascia podcasts recently, and they've gone down really well. So there's so much here. This is I'm loving this, by the way, Christopher.
Thank you. That's great. I mean, I've trained in structural integration with Tom Maher and stuff, so I've got the background of that, and psychological training, and about 45 years of yogic pranayama. So my background is Chinese traditional practices. I have this traditional yogic name because I used to hang around. I was initiated into practices and from Tibet and China and India. So I've got all that background. That background then later on, because until you've got functional breathing in place, there's no point in doing anything else. And I think that's one of the things is all the other stuff people are doing. We could talk about conscious connected breathing, for example. Maybe you should go there. I could be very controversial about that. I think it's really fascinating. I think it's really fascinating practice, first of all. I hear there's I'm being misquoted on West websites. Somebody told me about a misquote about something I said, but I don't mind. Doesn't matter. Conscious connected breathing is extremely problematic. If anybody doesn't know conscious connected breathing, it's where you breathe in. Often it's taught orally, so you breathe through your mouth. So if you think about that, if you're breathing orally and that is a dysfunctional breathing practice for you, that's going to aggravate that. It's not necessarily a good thing to do. But you breathe in through your mouth, usually, not always, and then just relax on the exhale. But if you watch that movement again, it's going to bring you into the upper chest. So again, if you've got a breathing pattern disorder, which is reverse or paradoxical breathing, where your primary engine of movement is up in the chest and there are other complications in the abdomen, then again, that could aggravate that quite substantially. But the main issue is that because you're breathing what's called more than metabolic demand, that is breathing more than your mitochondria need, because actually all of this comes down to mitochondria. And mitochondria, if you don't know what they are, they're the, people call them the powerhouses of the cells. They're kind of that, but they're much, much more than that and much more interesting than that. There's a whole, we could do a whole podcast on mitochondria. They are fishing amazing. And they're why we have, it's not true, but what people call dimorphic sexuality, why we have two-ish sexes and the whole intersex zone in the middle. Dimorphic's the wrong term. But the reason we have that, and the reason we age, and the reason we die, and the reason we get ill is because of mitochondria, because they're not functioning properly in the cells. That's one of the key reasons. So, and breathing is directly connected to those, because what breathing does is deliver the right amount of oxygen at the right time in the right place to each of those mitochondria. And if we're messing with that, we're messing with our biology big time. And if we look at the roots of any of the main diseases that people die of in the model age, which are cardiovascular disease, cancer, dementia, and diabetes, those are the four main ones, big ones, the four biggies. All of those are connected to metabolic dysfunction. So that means the cells aren't working properly. And when it comes down to the cells not working properly, we're talking about the mitochondria not working properly. So dementia is directly linked to mitochondrial dysfunction in some way or another, as is cardiovascular disorder. So all these things are linked to how we breathe. So if we're breathing badly and making a regular habit of it, we can be complicating our health condition. So if somebody goes into a breathe where they're breathing more than metabolic demand, more than the mitochondria need, what they're doing when they're doing that is pumping carbon dioxide out their blood. And if you're doing that for an hour, you're pumping carbon dioxide out your blood for an hour, then what you're doing is you're deoxygenating your brain. And of course, that's why people do conscious connected breathing, because it takes you into a near-death experience. However, the problem is if you're already compromised metabolically, so if you're not diagnosed as diabetic, but you're pre-diabetic, so that means your insulin is, you've got a level of insulin insensitivity and you can't move glucose easily from the blood, so you've got high glucose levels, things like that. If you've already got some compromise in your heart muscle, taking yourself into a position where you're reducing the oxygen into those places is not necessarily a very smart move. So I think really we should be filtering and checking clients before we do things like that to make sure people are metabolically well. Otherwise, we should just do functional breathing. And I've seen this stuff in festivals. I don't do it in festivals. I wouldn't do it. And I see it online as well, where people are doing stuff online. They're doing big breathes online, but you're not checking people when they're coming in. You don't know what's, I came across one person who told me that she'd been in a catatonic state after an online breathe for about 40 minutes and her boyfriend found her on the floor in the kitchen afterwards. This kind of thing, this is giving breathwork a bad name. And it's not helping people be well. We're assuming that what we're doing is a good thing because it helps some people. And sometimes, and it does have benefit. Hypoxia, reducing oxygen to the brain or the cells, has some benefit for some individuals. It's called hormesis. So it can be a good thing to do, but it has to be the right individuals. Otherwise, we're harming people. That's a problem.
Yeah.
Conscious connected breathing can be a massive problem. It has to be done well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I see this time and time again, people talking about trauma release breathing.
Yeah.
What does that mean? How do you release trauma? Are you releasing trauma? Because I've been through these techniques and I've done rebirth in hot water and all these beautiful things.
Yeah.
But nothing integrated really for me in the sessions that I did. Nothing really changed. When I zoomed out and looked at the last couple of years post doing that, nothing really shifted. And so I'm just, I'd love to get your thoughts on what's going on with this trauma release movement we're seeing at the moment.
I'm just aware that we could talk for hours on this as well, just to say this. So we're just skating on the top of the surface in a way, and I'm aware of that. I think the magic word you said is integration. And with any event that happens where people go into any kind of altered state in any situation at all, and there are many ways that people do that in the modern world, right? If there isn't integration strategies, then it's almost a waste of time. It was just a little experience. right? Good or bad, it was an experience, and because there has to be ways of integrating that into meaningfully into daily life. So without that, it's not helpful. So if you've got patterns in the body, which may be, those held patterns that we're talking about in the fascia, in the way we breathe and in the way we think, the perceptual mechanisms, the way we interpret and make meaning out of the universe around us, because, complex childhood adverse situations or adversity and complexity later in life, we have to make meanings out of that because that's what we human beings do. Our brain makes meanings and tells stories. It's a storytelling device and a meaning-making device to anticipate what could happen next and how that might impact the future. So it depends what we're doing up here, hence the mind training stuff, and how that impacts breathing and how it impacts the body. So if we don't have meaningful strategies on those three levels of body and the breath and the mind, then, integrated into daily life after that point, nothing much is going to change because the patterns are often really strong and they will recapitulate to that place. We breathe in those particularly constrained, difficult patterns because it was a survival need at a particular point in time. They're deep. Do you think you can undo them in one big breathe? Then that's probably not real. So, but what happens in those contexts, of course, is, and again, it gets complicated because trauma is very different for different individuals who interpret it in different ways. It's not one thing. And if those traumatized patterns, and trauma is simply, let's name trauma a little bit. Trauma is simply something that happens to an individual which they can't emotionally process or make substantive meaning out of and can't integrate into their life. So it remains as some kind of stuck pattern, cognitively, emotionally, physically. So it's a range of different approaches. And people talk about trauma being stuck in the body. There isn't a place you'll find trauma in the body. It's not like in your big toe or somewhere like that. It's not going to live in your left buttock. But the patterns of myofascial tensioning which can occur are an element of that traumatic holding pattern, the way somebody's managed things. So if we go into a breathing pattern, start changing all that stuff, there's a possibility that new information can flood up through the vagus nerve to the brain. So one of the things that can happen in, say, something like a big conscious connected breathe, if you stay with the practice in that way, is you can get a flood of information up to the brain. Because one thing that happens in trauma is people shut down information from the body. Right? Now, I don't think that just going into a big conscious connected breathe is the smartest way to do that. I think doing it more incrementally through a whole range of approaches over time is probably more sustainable and more integratable into life big term over time. But if somebody is doing that, you're going to have a new flood of information coming into the brain. Now, as you go into that hypoxic state, because you're reducing oxygen into the brain, your limbic system's going to get disinhibited. So whatever's going on there, there's stuff going to happen in your brain. The meanings you make, and some bits of the brain get shut down because the more hypoxic you get, the more you breathe like that. There are bits of the brain that are going to close down because your brain's in survival mode. So it's going to shut down the bits that aren't that necessary for staying alive right now. So you're going to get something happening. Now, one of the things that can happen, it may be an authentic trauma release, and sometimes I'm sure it is, whatever release means. A release, I would suggest, is more of a transparent moment, a moment of recognition of the complexity of previous trauma, which would then one has to work on and undo over time. And that might be signaled by a cathartic emotional experience. Somebody might start crying or wailing or something like that. Because when we get stuck emotions in the body, they're sometimes called secondary emotions, where they become a kind of life perspective. One of the key things is to unfreeze those and move those to begin with, so we can start to reveal primary emotions, which primary emotions are emotions that are responding to the context, and they last 90 seconds to 9 minutes. So if something's there as a kind of mode or a mood of operation, a slightly depressed or unhappy state, that's more likely a secondary emotion, especially if it comes out in somebody's approach to life and their storytelling. Life's really hard. That's a storytelling. Life's really difficult. That's a story. It's not, it's not the truth. It's just a story. But those kind of approaches come through in various ways. So that unsticking and unfreezing can be profoundly valuable. But I wouldn't say it's, the other complexity comes though, because one of the things that happens when you reduce oxygen to the brain is you get what's called a glutamate storm. And glutamate is the excitability neurotransmitter in the brain. And because of the impacts of the reduction of oxygen on the cell membranes, they dump glutamate into the brain. And that gives you that excitability. So sometimes what happens to people is a glutamate storm. How do you know the difference? Is it real trauma release, or is it just a glutamate storm because you've got somebody into a hypoxic state? And is it beneficial to go into a glutamate storm? Probably not. So it's a complex terrain again, and one of the limitations is that we just don't actually have enough research. So people invent stories. People come up with a story. We human beings love bias, a thing called bias confirmation. Bias confirmation is where we prove ourselves right with all the evidence available, right? We're really good at it. Really, really good. So we're constantly trying to do that, whether we like it or not. And if we think we're not doing bias confirmation, we most certainly are. It's a weird game we do. Yeah. So when we get into that kind of bias confirmation, which is proving ourselves right, we do that with our favorite methodology. I know it's right because, even so, it's complex. It's a complex terrain, and we've got a lot of work to do in terms of delving deeper into it. But it's an interesting one for sure. But I think that sort of more sustainable bit by bit approach is probably more better when it can be integrated into life. That's where it really makes the changes.
Yeah.
I suspect. So I had a qualify with an I suspect on the end. Yeah, I'm trying to avoid my own bias confirmation there.
What's your take on TRE, sometimes known as trauma release exercises, sometimes known as tension release exercises, which is not really a breath practice, it's more of a tremor practice. Give us your thoughts on that.
I think it's interesting. I've got my own version of it that I work with. I've got which is linked with breathing as well, so I bring in breath into it. I think it's a profoundly useful strategy to encourage people to loosen up patterns in the body and potentially learn how to release stuff, not grip onto stuff. The basic principle is that other mammals let go of complexity by shaking. And we, particularly our cultures, we're very culturally entrained creatures. And, I'm British, and I keep a very stiff upper lip. Take it on the chin for the empire and all that, Actually, I'm bilingual, actually. My mother's from Yorkshire, so when I go up north of Manchester, I talk different, and it's very different up there because people are slightly different. Right? But, we have particular cultural entrainments around emotion and how we express, and gender-based entrainment, male and females, guys, don't cry, it's okay to be angry. Women, it's not. Those are classical conditioning patterns, those kind of things. Who says? It's all kind of, made up by culture. None of it's accurate or real, but it's like, we have those patterns and we buy into those patterns when we're young. So if we have patterns like that again, it's going to get complicated. And all of those patterns are connected to breathing. So if you're doing stuff with shaking and releasing, it's not a bad thing to do. If it's helpful, do it. If you feel better afterwards and you feel that your capacity to be present in the world in a kinder, more engaged, more meaningful way is improved, then something's working for you.
Yeah, I've had some nice experiences with some tension release. I don't really use the trauma version of it or the trauma word at the start, but definitely tension is released. Yeah.
Well, my background, one of my backgrounds is pretty strong yogasana. I used to travel the world teaching a long time ago, and in that practice, what you're doing is, the way we used to do it. Number one is the breath practice, because the breath has to be regulated properly. With that, it was like a 4 to 6 second inhale, 4 to 6 second exhale. So you're regulating the breath. So that's approaching any tensional patterns from the end of the mind, because tensional patterns aren't just the body, they're the mind. If you put somebody under general anesthetic, there's no tensional pattern left, they're floppy. You take them out of general anesthetic and all of a sudden the patterns come back on again. Yeah? So the patterns are a mental construct as well. They're not the body itself. So approaching it with the breath is really useful as well. And then coming into the movement pattern, approaching it both from the end of, vibrating, moving fascial webs and, whatever you do with that, or, working one muscle group and then the other muscle group in opposing dynamics, or, however you play with that, and then linking the breath into it, I think is probably a pretty useful strategy in terms of approaching that. And it's going to be a benefit, I imagine, for just about anybody, because most people will have some kind of pattern like that.
Yeah, that's interesting about the general anesthetic. I haven't heard that before.
Yeah, it's interesting on that.
Yeah. I've got a CO2 question for you, just going back to a couple of
Yeah.
conversations ago.
Mm.
So there's a term, I think it's called CO2 therapy. I think James Nestor wrote about it in the breath book. He took a 30% CO2 breath.
Yeah.
You might be familiar with Anders Olsen work. I know Peter Litchfield's big into CO2. I've got him coming on the show in a couple of weeks, actually.
Yeah, great.
But I'd love to just get your take on this. When we absorb CO2, when we take in a CO2 breath, be it what Anders has got, where he's synced up a soda stream to a mask. It's far more complicated than that, but that's the general version. You can adjust the amount of CO2. I'm
Yeah,
just struggling to get clarity on this, really, so I'd love to get your thoughts. If we take in a CO2 breath, be it a 30% breath in the lab or an 8% breath, or got my little CO2 monitor, we're at 1295 at the moment in here. What is going on? Can you talk me through what is going on when I take in more CO2? Because I'm struggling to get my head around, do we reabsorb it? Does it jump back onto the hemoglobin? Does it go back into the body? So what is that process of us breathing in a higher CO2 breath? Because we're getting oxygen still, but why are we feeling panicky when there's more CO2 in a room, or if we take a big CO2 breath? Yes, I'm just trying to figure out from a biological point of view, what happens when we breathe in CO2?
Well, carbon dioxide is critical for function. It's, we need, if you look at the amount of oxygen that gets into mitochondria, it's around about 1%. So it's 21% in the air, it's about 1% in mitochondria. So we don't need lots of oxygen. Oxygen is highly reactive and destructive, actually. So I saw a funny post recently where a guy was going on about he didn't like the idea that oxygen is toxic. Well, it is. It's it's one of the most reactive substances on planet Earth because it gives and it receives electrons freely, relatively freely. So it binds really well to things. So think about what it does to metal. Most metal. It doesn't do it to gold, which is why we like gold. But most metal will rust or change. It'll become an oxide. So oxygen is managed really well in the system. But carbon dioxide is critical both in terms of enabling oxygen movement, and we make it all the time. We're making carbon dioxide 24/7, so the mitochondria are pumping out carbon dioxide 24/7 from the burning of fuel linked with the oxygen input. So an amount of oxygen up to about 45 millimeters of mercury, which millimeters of mercury is the way we measure partial pressure of gases in anything. So in the blood, it's measured in a certain way. So when there's that carbon dioxide level is reached at about 45 millimeters of mercury or so, maybe a little bit more than that, then your brain starts to kick in and let you know that you've reached a place where you need to get rid of some more carbon dioxide. Right? So if we go too low, below 35 millimeters of mercury of carbon dioxide or above 45 millimeters of carbon dioxide, your brainstem, which is measuring carbon dioxide levels, and it's specifically carbon dioxide levels because it's got a really neat way of looking at how to measure that because the blood-brain barrier filters. What it's doing is specifically measuring that. So if it goes above or below that, it's going to increase breathing rate or decrease breathing rate. It's going to change your breathing rate quite dramatically and quite quickly because of those impacts. Now, to a degree, that depends on what your trained breath patterns. So entrained breath patterns impact that as well. There's therapies available where people are looking at very high level oxygen and very high level carbon dioxide for basically healing complexities in the body. So hyperbaric oxygen, for example, is used for cancer treatment to a degree, sometimes, one of the treatments available. There may be other avenues for it. I'm not a medical doctor in this way, so I'm going to give you very limited information on this. But, both increased and decreased amounts of carbon dioxide, to a degree, both have their hormetic value, depending on the individual. So it's very individually focused. It's dose dependent, in other words. So how much carbon dioxide, too much, is it, beyond 45, or how much carbon dioxide below 35 is hormetic and is dose dependent, individual dose dependent. But what it's going to do is increase the acidity or the alkalinity of the blood. How it gets across the lung lining is simply through diffusion. All gases move through the system by diffusion, which means they move from high concentration to lower concentration. So if you've got more coming into your lungs, then what you're going to do is you're going to get more absorbed into the arteries simply through diffusion. right? That's the only way it can get in. So what you're doing is increasing the amount of carbon dioxide in the blood, which is increasing the acidity of the blood. And so you're going to change things in the system because of that homeostatic shift of the acidity of the blood. Right?
So they're not necessarily jumping in on the CO. They're not necessarily jumping in on the hemoglobin. They're getting into the plasma, or both.
Well, it can do both because I mean, hemoglobin, carbon dioxide is carried in the blood, mostly in the hemoglobin. Carbon dioxide doesn't dissolve in water very quickly. It's quite slow. So in terms of biological systems, it's way too slow to be of much use in the blood. So there's this amazing enzyme called carbonic anhydrase, which is super fast. And what it does is it grabs hold of CO2 and splits it into a hydrogen ion and a bicarbonate ion, but it does that in the hemoglobin. And then those ions can then be released into the blood. So the carbon dioxide, if you think of it being carried in some way, is carried or moved through the hemoglobin to then be split by carbonic anhydrase. So the hemoglobin play a role in that, or the red blood cells play a role in that, in terms of, that's the place where carbonic anhydrase acts. I think there are, as I remember, the 4 kinds of carbonic anhydrase. So 2 of them in breathing. One of them is the red blood cells, but the other is to get carbon dioxide from the blood out into the lungs. It operates the other way. It's a different version of carbonic anhydrase. But that's one of the key things, is the enzyme in there. So it's going to work through the hemoglobin. It's going to work through into that to get into the blood. But it's through diffusion. That's the only way any gas moves through our body, through the wetness of the body, is through diffusion, because it moves from higher concentration into lower concentration. And so we're enabling that. So the respiratory mechanisms and the membranes allow that to happen well.
Okay. So when I hold my breath and my CO2 goes up, and that's detected, and my urge to breathe increases, that's like an internal process. But if I was to take a big old CO2 breath, I'm probably going to feel an urgency quite quickly. The same thing's pretty much happening. That CO2 has been diffused into my body. It's gone around. It's been detected by the chemoreceptors.
Yeah,
So
and there's
external or internal, it's...
Yeah, and there's receptors in different parts of the brain as well. So you get amygdalic ion receptors in the brain. The amygdala, for example, there's receptors in the brain as well, which will pick up on that increased acidity, which is what they're picking up on really, is hydrogen ions, because that's what, So it's not per se measuring carbon dioxide. It's measuring the hydrogen ions particularly, and that change in acidity that brings. But that's what's being measured. I mean, having said that, the brain does move carbon dioxide across the blood-brain barrier and then split it as well. So it gets a bit more complicated. But that's being measured in the brain. And of course, there was wasn't it in James Nestor's book where he talked about somebody who had some amygdalic damage, somebody who never felt fear, as a woman, wasn't it? Who never felt fear. And then they gave her a big puff of carbon dioxide, and she felt fear for the first time because it was hitting her at the amygdalic level, a sub-amygdala level, brainstem level. So that's really it, probably amygdala as well in terms of iron receptors. But you get that, that's powerful stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, if we can keep it below that fear-based level, but, into an interesting zone, it then has other effects, less scary effects, if you like. So we're looking at where is the medical or hormetic benefit, what point is it for that individual above 45 millimeters. And if you're doing something like a breath hold, if you do a good breath hold, you can get your carbon dioxide levels up to 50 mils easily. If you do a good breath hold and stay there for a while, you can build it up. And that's kind of nice to do that. I do it every day. I have a breath practice. I've been doing breath practice. There's a little boast here, to put my boast in. Whatever it does for me, I've got no idea. I don't know what it proves, right? Because it depends on the quality, of course. But I've been doing breath practice every day for the last 50 years, which is fun. And it's interesting because it keeps changing as well, right? But the breath holds are part of that for me. And I think of breath holds then as a way of approaching that fear-based system. In yoga practice, which is, deep yoga is one of my traditions, there's a thing called abhinivesha in yoga. And abhinivesha means fear of dying. And the fear of dying is also the fear of living. Yeah, it's the fear of taking risks. It's holding back, which is also, by the way, connected to shame as well and other things, emotions in the body. But there's that fear of dying there. And they're saying every living thing has the fear of dying, abhinivesha in it. And so one of the things we're doing by doing breath holds, and I do them in the morning before I've eaten, is then it takes us into that edge of that kind of, physiological fear. And if we do it there, then everything else in the day is small stuff. It's just, okay, we can deal with it. No problem. I've been close to death this morning. It's all right. Let's just do something else. It's fine. It's all good. Whatever. So it's kind of cool at that level, in terms of working with stress management through prevention, if you like. Not picking up the pieces at the end, but by creating a state in your system whereby the things that happen seem less important in terms of their intensity.
Yeah. From the evolutionary point of view, I'd love to get your take on this. I've seen people talk online about the fact that, and I'm sure this isn't 100% accurate, but generally animals don't hold their breaths. And so we shouldn't hold our breaths either. I know you got the whole fishing and diving thing and aquatic stuff, but and I know we're unique. I know what you spoke about earlier was very interesting, but where's your thought on this side, the evolutionary benefits of breath holding, and is it something gatherer hunters used to do you think, or is it something we've had to find now to help us as a solution to the modern problems that have been created?
Well, I would say that some of the practices I do go back 4,500 years. That's, we're talking hunter-gatherers or gatherer-hunters. We're talking going back 10 to 20k years. There are still a few groups of people living like that on planet Earth, but they're rapidly being changed by cigarettes and tools and all the other things that contemporary civilization brings with it. But the 4,500 years of clinical expertise from the yogic tradition or from the Chinese tradition, 3,500 years from there, they've got some comments to say, I think, because they've been working. And again, if you look at those traditions, if you look at Chinese medical systems, they were really interesting, because what they did was, if I beg your pardon, let's do this right. If a client got sick, the doctor stopped being paid because they'd failed at their job. So the job was to keep somebody well. So it's completely different in its origin in terms of perspective. So Asian medical systems are what I call flow medicines. I've studied Chinese medicine and Ayurveda and stuff like this as part of my work to explore these things, all right? But these traditions were there to keep people well. And if you couldn't manage it yourself with the practice you did, you got somebody to come and help you. So an Ayurvedic practitioner is somebody who helps you create what they call a dinacharya, a daily program to keep you well, because you're overeating or because you're not moving enough or not doing whatever it is that you need to do to change, to stay well. But those kind of discipline-based systems, the martial arts and yogic practice and stuff like that, were part of the overall kind of cultural training of staying well. So the whole emphasis of medicine there is, how do you stay well? So breath holding is a key part of that, and it's been around for at least 4,500 years. So that's in the written traditions we have as well, going back through the Vedas and stuff like that. So there's quite a lot of evidence that it's been used a lot. And just because an animal doesn't do it, I don't think an animal reads or plays the piano. I've never seen my cat play the piano. And it certainly doesn't play the guitar, but I do. So does that mean I should stop playing the guitar as well? Yeah. People think that natural is something that isn't human. This is nature. No, this is nature. Look at it. It looks like it even. No, I'm playing with my shirt there. But, I think of cities as like, I was in Saigon once, Ho Chi Minh City, I beg your pardon, Ho Chi Minh City. And I went out with some friends there on a bike ride, and we came back in bike, and there was all these motorcycles streaming into the city like ants, down this long road. And I thought, this is like a termite mound. What evolution and nature done is just like it piles up termite mounds, it piles up cities. It's just that we mold the earth in slightly different ways. We call it concrete and stuff like that, but it's still nature. There's only nature. There's nothing that isn't nature. So everything's natural. It's just that it's different. It's different. Human natural is different to dog natural or cat natural. So I think these, people love these kind of eco-romantic distinctions, and also we're still in evolution. We're changing. We're changing really rapidly. So whilst our system may well struggle, if you look at hunter-gatherers or gatherer-hunters, they would have moved an awful lot more than most of us do. But they certainly never did a triathlon. If you look at those people, they had to work hard for their calories. You had to get up in the morning, go out digging or go out looking for something to eat. And it was hard work to get what you needed to stay alive. And most of them were hungry a lot of the time. Right? So you don't just go out for some immense, great big run because it's a fun thing to do. You only run when you need to. I saw in Professor Dan Liederman's book, his Exercise, a brilliant book, and he was talking about, he used to working with some Mexican people. He said, so when do you, these are the famous barefoot runners, and he said, so when do you run? He said, well, to catch the goat. Yeah, because in those contexts, to go out doing some Ironman triathlon, it just doesn't make any sense, doesn't make any calorific sense. So, but that's what we're doing. That's what we're doing now. So, everything's changing, and everything is always going to change because change is the nature of things. So when we come back to breath and start thinking about breath, how do we use the breath to optimize and be with the changes that we're working with now? And that's a really interesting question then. Yeah.
What research or evidence do you know about respiratory rates through the ages? I've heard that since the 1960s, when Buteyko was measuring some of this, we've seen an increase. Do you have any thoughts or evidence on what it was like as we go further back, what a typical respiratory rate might vary compared to today?
I haven't looked at any research yet on that. There is a rate that works with what's called compliance and resistance. So compliance and resistance is the air coming in, and compliance is the movement of the tissues to work with that. So compliance of the muscle bone tissues, respiratory tissues, lungs and so forth, and resistance. And the balance of that compliance resistance, there's a sweet spot which comes out around about 12 to 15 breaths a minute. So that's won't have substantially changed in the last 10,000 years. The whole point about 10 to 20,000 years isn't enough to create, although we are changing, it's not enough to create massive change. So that will be fairly consistent over that period of time, that 12 to 15 rate. If we look at, practices like encouraging optimal HRV or something like that, then you're down to about 5 to 6 breaths a minute. So that kind of respiratory rate has a different function, but you don't want to be breathing like that all the time. Certainly not if you go for a run. But it has a usage, and it has a usage within movement practice, like the yogasana practice I used to do. There's a rate there of 6 to 8 breaths a minute or so that has a functional use within that. And by functional, I mean it works within that particular context. Functional doesn't mean something that works within every context. Functional, by definition, means it's working within a context. So that 12 to 15 rates is kind of average, relaxed breathing rate. If we look at the yogic tradition, meditative depth traditions, by yogic I don't just mean bending and moving in a yoga studio in the modern world, because that's very different to traditional yoga. Then we're talking about getting breath rate down to below 3 breaths a minute. Because when we drop the breath below 3 breaths a minute and get down to 1 breath a minute, then we're talking about changing brainwave patterns. We're talking about doing different things in the brain and using the breath as an access route into a whole different way of working inside the brain. Because that's what the aim of those practices are, is to change function at that level then. So there's a range of different approaches then, from everything 12 to 15. But I think the average breath these days post-COVID is somewhere around about 20, which probably isn't that beneficial. Low and slow, I think, is nasal, low and slow, isn't it? It's what most people need to do.
Yeah, slow it down. Yeah. We've almost done an hour, almost to the second actually. I can't believe that time's gone so fast. I've loved listening to you talk about all these things. I could go on for a lot longer. I just want to ask a couple of last quick questions, if that's okay.
Thank you, by the way, as well. I really appreciate talking with you as well.
It's been wonderful. What if somebody watching or listening to this right now, maybe just give us a little bit of a flavour, like what are a couple of things they should consider doing or stopping? So starting or stopping when it comes to, good breathing patterns, reducing stress, anxiety. It tends to be whenever I poll this community, what are you looking for? Athletic performance, stress and anxiety normally comes out about 70 to 80% of the results, pretty much every single poll we've ever done. So maybe you could give us a bit of your wisdom on some things people could consider looking at for helping reduce some of that.
I think there's some really simple things you can do, and I think those are probably the most useful. One of the most simple things, and I think of it as a core practice, is awareness of breathing. Now, of course, awareness of breathing is simply paying attention to what your breath is actually doing. And if you're not doing that and then you're altering it without paying attention to what's happening, you don't know what you're altering it from, or you don't know what happens afterwards. So it's kind of useful to have that metric, that way of understanding, actually, this is what my body's doing. This is what's happening right now. And if you want to do it to a level where it's going to, and again, if you can use awareness of breathing to restructure your dopamine systems and to build new neural bridges in the prefrontal cortex. So it's a really profound practice if you take it far enough. I mean, really profound, because it alters the kind of biological algorithmic function in the front of the brain. But that aside, if you're not going to do it for half an hour, then doing it for 5 minutes is really good. And I recommend people to build a habit of breathing. And first of all, it's nasal breathing. If you don't, and I've got a post, my YouTube channel, pinned right at the top of it, is a nasal retraining video. Because people are taught to nasally breathe. But the reality is, if somebody's been mouth breathing, if somebody's been breathing through their mouth at night time, the pressure changes through those two passages. The positive pressure through a mouth breath, and you may be able to feel it if you breathe in. If you feel that, the soft palate at the back lifts slightly, and the nasal passages close slightly, because of the negative pressure in the nasal pharynx, nasal passages there. So if you do that over and over and over again, say during night time, or if you're going running and you're nasal breathing, what you're training your nose to do is to shut down. So you can't just suddenly nasally breathe. If you gaffer tape your hand up like that with gaffer tape for a week or two and take the gaffer tape off, you won't be able to use your fingers. You won't be able to pull them apart because your brain's translated that as if it's one thing. Your sensory map has changed, so you can't access the motor map. You can't move the muscles. So it's the same in there. So you've got to retrain that first of all, and there are strategies to do that. So the nasal training video is a good one to do. And if you link that, if you do snore at night time, link that with nasal tape. That's a really good strategy. And also get a practice in place of sitting and watching your breath for a few minutes. But to do that, you've got to get a habit in place. Because the thing about breath work is it relies on regularity. It relies on regularity and sensible repetition, not just doing one thing. So getting it as a daily practice, and I talk about the 3-5, 3-6-5, which is where you get, and people rarely do 3-5, so let's call it 2-5, all right? But you you do 5 minutes after you cleaned your teeth, because you're piggybacking that habit on the habit of cleaning your teeth. You learned to clean your teeth. You didn't do it as a baby, all right? So it's a learned habit. So if you put 5 minutes of just paying attention to your breathing on the back of that, you've got a breath practice in place. And then you do it before you eat in midday. Most people eat at midday, sometime around there. Well, pay attention to your breath for 5 minutes and do it an hour before you go to bed. You don't want to do any focus practices before you go to bed directly. It'll keep you awake a bit. So if you do it an hour before, but if you can do those 3 times a day, just paying attention, first of all, that's a really good start because you've got a breath habit. And if you don't have that in place, it's very difficult then to do anything meaningful with breath work after that. You've got to build in that repetition on a regular basis. So habit creation is really important, I think. What you can then add to that is something real simple, like doing coherence breath, 6-6 breathing, 5-5, 5.5, 6 seconds, something like that, just for a few minutes again. Yeah? And then I would add in triangle breathing on top of that, because triangle breathing gives you the opportunity to feel which breath hold feels right. So you get to check out your trauma triggers. Is it the inhale breath hold that feels really comfortable, or the exhale breath hold? Start with the one that's comfortable, and then gradually build in the other one as well. But so you're checking the breath hold, and I would say doing anything where you're pushing a breath hold for a maximum hold or something like that, it's not a good thing to begin with. Just listen to your body. What's your body say? I've got this big thing I call the yin edge of listening, which is actually listening to your physiology, listening to your body. What does your body say about it? Because the more you listen, hence the embodied awareness comes in, the more you have the capacity to listen to this, the more you can work effectively with it, rather than just dominating it and pushing and pulling it around, which is a lot of what goes on. And that's half the problem we face in the world, is kind of, domination of nature. So we're not going to do the same thing in the breath work. So you've got a simple practice there, a few minutes of awareness of breathing, could extend the exhale at the end, but leave that out for a minute, keep it real simple, coherence breath, and then to a simple practice of just triangle breathing, work out which breath hold to work with. And do that and start creating a little practice for yourself to begin with and see how it feels. Because again, like I said, it's regularity and it's repetition over time. Because if you've got some dysfunctional breathing, another thing is if you've got dysfunctional breathing pattern, talk to somebody, talk to a professional who can help you turn it around. Because there are strategies. If you've got a breathing pattern that's oral up here, you can radically transform your life simply by turning that around. So if you don't know a professional breath worker, get in touch with me. I'm sure Mike can help you. I'm sure many people can help you. But that is critical to turn that around, because your whole system is running on a sympathetic nervous system stress-based function then, which is not going to give you the best quality of life. It's going to lead you to trouble. So get that turned around. So a few pieces there to take away, I would say.
That's really helpful. Thank you so much for that. Anything we've not covered, Christopher, that you wanted to cover?
Should mention my book.
Let's go for it. Yes, please. Tell us about it.
It's in editing process at the moment. We've got a 2-volume contract with a publishing house, which is amazing. I say we because I'm writing it with a co-author. I've got a colleague. There's 2 of us doing it together, which is really nice. It's good fun. We're having fun with teamwork. So at the moment we're clarifying the illustrations and we're getting it in editing. We're hoping to get it out end of this year, beginning of next year for the first volume. And the manuscript for the second book has to be in to the publisher in May 2025. So we're going number 2 out. So the first one's kind of setting the frame. It's about breath. It's about breath and the evolution and the mismatch and why we breathe badly and how to breathe better and all that kind of stuff. So the science of breath work, if you like. So very science-based. Everything in there is kind of referenced and validated like it should be for a science-based book. So it's been fun to do, and we're looking forward to getting that out. And we're hopefully it's going to be well received. We'll see what the world thinks about it. But we're working on volume 2 at the moment as well. So that's kind of fun project.
I can't wait to read them.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, fantastic. We'll have to have you back if you want when you've got them out, and we can talk about them and pick them apart.
Please. That'd be good fun.
Great.
You have to read it first, okay?
Of course, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I look forward to that. Cool. Well, that's it for this one then. So thank you so much for your time. Anybody watching, all Christopher's links are down below in the show notes. So I encourage you to check out his YouTube channel, his website, all his good stuff. And Christopher, thank you again for your time, and I hope to have you back at some point in the near future.
Appreciate it. Thanks again, Mike. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you. Cheers. Thanks, everyone.
Hey, thank you so much for sticking all the way through to the end of that podcast. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And I just have a quick question for you. Would you do us a favor and leave us a comment down below with one thing that you learned from the podcast, or one thing that you want to take away and implement into your own life? And if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to our Breathwork in a Blink. It's our 5-minute easy read newsletter. It comes out every single Friday. And in that, I'm sharing things like my favorite breathing exercise of the week, a study that I've been reading on breathing. We've got a wild card section. We've got all these different bits, and it's been designed so you can read it and scan through it in less than 5 minutes and pick out something you'd like to go deeper on. It's completely free. You can unsubscribe anytime and join the nearly 10,000 other people that have subscribed to this wonderful email newsletter. Link is down below, and I look forward to serving you each and every Friday.